Hello and welcome to our inaugural episode of From the Cheap Seats. We are your weekly internet show covering news issues from politics to current affairs, lifestyles, religion, sports, you name it. If it's in the news, we're going to try and cover it. I'm your host, Vincent Opper. On this week's episode, we're going to have Chipp Jones from Washington, D.C., and he's going to discuss his bout that he had with coronavirus and the current state in his hometown of Washington, D.C. And then we're going to finish with some baseball and some Nascar in our sports segment. But first, we're going to take a look at looting and bully culture. You know, since George Floyd, we have experienced protesting on a scale not seen since the 1960 Civil Rights Movement. We have protesting, we have looting, we have rioting, and many times these terms are kind of used interchangeably in the news. And it gets kind of convoluted. We're not sure what means what. So what we're going to do to begin with is kind of unpack what these terms mean. We're going to start with protesting. What is protesting? A protest is a public expression of objection, disapproval, or dissent towards an idea or course of action. Typically, it's a political one, but it doesn't necessarily have to be political in form. Protests can take many different shapes, from individual statements to mass demonstrations. And I'll give you a few examples. My wife and I come home from work and I look at her and I say, "What's for dinner?" And she says, "Well, we're going to have fish." I don't like fish. I mean, I like it, but it's not something that I want to make for dinner, you know, maybe every now and then have fish. But whenever she says we're going to have fish for dinner, I kind of protest. I don't make up a sign and hold it up that says, "Fish suck." No, this is my protest. I'll go, something like that. I'll sigh. My communication to her lets her know that I'm not too hot on fish for dinner tonight. Now, of course, we still may have fish for dinner because not all protests are heated, but I do protest and let her know that I don't want fish for dinner. Now, let's kind of put this in a corporate setting or in a public setting. Let's say that we are living in Nowheresville, Idaho, population 1,000. And in Nowheresville, Idaho, a company comes in and says, "You know what, we're going to put an adult bookstore in the strip mall." So the citizens in Nowheresville kind of call each other, "Do you want an adult bookstore in a strip mall?" No. So they get together and they make signs. Pornography is wrong. You're going to go to hell, whatever these signs are going to make. And they hold them up and they get on the walkway, the public walkway, and they picket. That's protesting. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Our country has been built on protests. Our country has been built when the public gets together, makes their signs, and they picket. And what they're trying to do is get their message out. In this case, they're saying, "Hey, in Nowheresville, Idaho, we don't want an adult bookstore." We also hear this term thrown around on the news, rioting. What is rioting? We kind of have a picture that a riot is two sides that are heavily armed and they come together in some sort of unofficial combat. Well, the definition of rioting is a tumultuous disturbance of the public peace by three or more persons assembled together and acting with a common intent. So let's get a few examples of rioting. Now, a few years ago, 2014, 2015, during the Michael Brown situation, I live close to St. Louis, so I was rather close to this. They would do protesting on a nightly basis and sometimes on a daily basis. And these protesters got together a few times and they thought, we need to make sure that we get our message out and we need to do something that's a little more emphatic than just walking around with signs and shouting. So what they decided to do is they would form a human barricade and they would shut down the interstate. And they did that on a few occasions. Now, was there any combat? Did we see any bombs explode? Were there gunshots? Did someone take a bat to someone's head? We didn't have any of that. But it was a tumultuous disturbance of the public peace by three or more people acting in a common interest. Now, their common interest was not to shut down the highway. Their common interest was to get their message out. We're not going to stand for police brutality. Now let's go back to our example of our adult bookstore. So you have the picketers in front. And let's say a couple decides they want to go into the adult bookstore. So the picketers decide they're going to form a human barrier and not let them in. And so when the people walk up to the picketers shove them. Now, a riot in the classical sense doesn't break out. They're not busting skulls or anything like that. But it is a form of rioting. It is a tumultuous disturbance that is disrupting the public peace. So, not all rioting is combat as we think about it. It can be, and usually it is, but not all the time. Which brings us to looting. What is looting? Looting is to rob, especially on a large scale, and is usually accompanied by violence and corruption. To use a legal vernacular, looting is breaking and entering on a mass scale. In our example from Nowheresville, Idaho, that night at the adult bookstore, a group of people get together and say, you know what, why don't we throw a brick through the window and then we can all grab all the stuff we want. We can grab blow-up dolls, gummy boobs, fleshlights, and all the dildos that we can carry out, and we'll just rob this place, loot it. That is what looting is. So when you're watching the news and you're seeing protesting and you're hearing rioting and you're hearing looting, know exactly what they're talking about at this point. Now, these are not exclusive to civil rights violations. For instance, the Tea Party movement. When the Tea Party movement happened about 10 years ago, there were situations where the Tea Party movement would actually, in their protests, shut down the traffic. That's a form of rioting, but you didn't hear that the Tea Party movement people are rioting. During the government shutdown, just 3 weeks ago in Michigan, when all the citizens, they got in front of the Capitol building heavily armed, and they said, you know, we are protesting, you're stomping on our civil rights, we need to go get haircuts, we need to sit down at Burger King and eat our Whoppers. That was a form of rioting because they were disrupting the public peace. Now, we don't think of the Tea Party movement and we don't think of this as rioting because there wasn't combat, it didn't turn into looting. But this is not exclusive to civil rights. Now, we tend to see the civil rights protesting and the civil rights rioting, and we tend to see it always spill into looting. Why is that? People say, well, it's a cultural thing, you know. That race is into looting. Now, let's look at it from a historical perspective. We are now on year 401 of dehumanizing an entire race on this continent. From 1619, when the first Africans arrived on this continent as slaves, through 1863, close to 250 years, we had enslaved an entire race of people. Now think about that. That's their heritage. I mean, I'm German. I got some Scottish in me. I think I got some Swiss in me, and I've got heritage of like the Southern Highlanders who left Germany for religious reasons, moved to Scotland for a while, settled in the Midwest. That's my heritage. A little proud of that. When your heritage is, hey, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather came over here on a ship and we've been enslaved for 250 years and it really hasn't been much better since then. That tends to kind of, you know, when you look back and that's your heritage, you think, wow, there's something messed up here. The Civil War ended in 1865. 1863, we had Emancipation Proclamation. 1865, the war is over. From 1865 through 1877, we have a period of Reconstruction. And during this time, we have federal troops in the South who are ensuring that the freed slaves have their civil rights. They can vote, they can hold office, and many do. They can start businesses. They have all the rights that we say is all American. The South doesn't like it. In 1877, we have a presidential election. Rutherford B. Hayes, who's an abolitionist from Ohio, is the Republican candidate. Samuel Tilden is the Democratic candidate. And we had a virtual tie. Now in 2000, we had a tie, so what did we do? We went back to Florida and we counted boats again, and we found out what hanging chads were and stuff of that nature. They didn't do this in 1877. They had a backroom agreement, and it was this: we will let Hayes take the presidency. In exchange for that, the North, the federal troops, have to remove the troops from the South on a practical level, ending Reconstruction. Hayes bid on it. Apparently his need for presidential power kind of trumped his abolitionist views. So in 1877, when the federal troops are pulled away, all hell breaks loose. We have the eras of lynching, Jim Crow laws, Southern political Anglo corruption, separate but equal. And this is what it was like to be an African American in the South. Were you slaves anymore? Not legally. But were you treated as outcasts in a caste system? Yes. Were you harassed? Yes. Were you murdered? Yes. And that's why we had a civil rights movement. Kind of kicked off in 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education, but it really picked up steam in 1955 with the Rosa Parks deciding she's not going to give up her seat on the bus. 1964, the Civil Rights Act is signed into law. Did this stop the civil rights movement? No. Dr. King was still marching after 1964. Malcolm X was active. The Black Panthers were active. We had all this activism still going for civil rights for African Americans. Why? Well, we don't need to look too far. I'll just give you a few incidents that happened within the first 12 months of the Civil Rights Act. 1964, we had the Harlem Riot. It occurred between June 16th and 22nd. It began after James Powell, a 15-year-old African-American, was shot and killed by Police Lieutenant Thomas Gilligan in front of Powell's friends and about a dozen other witnesses. Now, it is sketchy whether or not he had a weapon, but one thing is for sure, if he had a weapon, it was only a knife, it wasn't a gun. And what we do know is that Thomas Gilligan shot him when it wasn't necessary. 1964. Rochester race riot. Police brutalized an intoxicated black male, which sparked unrest and sparked the riot. Philadelphia race riot took place in the predominantly black neighborhoods of North Philadelphia from August 28th to August 30th of 1964. Tensions between the black residents of the city and the police had been escalating for several months over several well-publicized allegations of police brutality. August 11, 1965, Marquette Fry, an African-American motorist on parole for robbery, was pulled over for reckless driving. A minor roadside argument broke out, which escalated into a fight with police. Community members reported that the police had hurt a pregnant woman, and 6 days of civil unrest followed. The reason why the civil rights movement didn't end with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is because it's one thing to have a law, and it's another thing to enforce a law. Just because there was an act that was made civil rights legal did not mean there was going to be civil rights. And it was continued to be proven, not just in the South, but in the North, as you know, I'm giving examples from the North, just the first 12 months following that. So they needed to carry on the civil rights movement. Now, let's jump ahead of the 70s and 80s, and let's get into the video age, when people had their video cameras and now they have their phone cameras. 1993, Rodney King was pulled over for a traffic violation and was brutally beat by several police officers in Los Angeles. In the trial, the officers were pronounced not guilty, even though we had video of a beaten and bloodied Rodney King on the ground, not doing anything, and they're still hitting him. 1996, St. Petersburg riots. Police officer Jim Knight accidentally shoots and kills unarmed 18-year-old Tyron Lewis. 2001, Cincinnati, officer Steve Roach kills unarmed Timothy Thomas. 2009, Oakland, a transit policeman fatally shoots unarmed Oscar Grant. 2014, we had Ferguson. 2015, Freddie Gray dies in police custody in Baltimore. Well documented. We could just watch the video and see all this. Now we're at George Floyd. That's the latest one. see the video, the cop just kneeling on him as if he doesn't have a care of the world. Because of time limits, this is not a comprehensive list, but a sample. So I implore you, do your own research. It's massive, the amount of documented information we have of police brutality towards the Black community. Now let's talk about looting a little bit, okay? First of all, I recognize that some of the looters in looting are nothing more than opportunists. Hey, I want a big screen TV and there's this picketing and rioting going on. Maybe they'll start some looting. I'm going to grab a big screen. That does happen. But looting also takes place as a statement. 401 years of slavery, dehumanization, lynching, and brutality. When it comes to police actions, very little has worked. We've had almost no progress. We still have the same issues going on. Protests haven't worked. Rioting hasn't worked. Laws haven't worked. The frustration of 401 years continues to grow and begets a strong reaction, which is looting. It's like this. You want me to be nice? I'll say it to you nice, but you're not listening to me. You want me to be a little more forceful, a little more dramatic? I'll be a little more forceful and a little more dramatic, but you're still not listening to me. You want me to throw a fit? You want me to go all medieval? I will do it if you don't start listening to me. You know, I like some people, you know, they're talking about, you know, why don't they do this peacefully? Hey, didn't Colin Kaepernick try to do it peacefully? And you said, no, not on the football field and not while the national anthem is playing. You need to go to a designated area at a different time and protest. That's not a protest because no one's going to pay attention to you. See, law enforcement reformation has been ignored. If you want frustrated people to stop behaving like frustrated people, you need to understand their frustration and remedy the problem. And now I want to talk just a little bit about bully culture. Any male who has been in a PE class or on a sporting team understands what bully culture is. And I venture to say that most females understand what bully culture is in their realm. It's like this. In the locker room, the person who has the strongest personality, the most aggressive personality, probably is physically a little more intimidating than the rest, they rule the culture. And what they say goes. And that is so powerful. And we have that problem in police departments throughout the nation. And a good example of that was the gentleman, the 75-year-old gentleman in Buffalo, who was pushed down by the police officers, who banged his head. You could clearly see the blood coming out. And one of the officers has a moment of compassion like most human beings would, and he starts to bend down to help this person. And the other officers say, nope, keep going. The bully culture was so strong that his basic human instinct to help was trumped by the strong personality of the biggest, strongest bull in the pen. See, this is one of the things we need in reformation of law enforcement. We need to get rid of this bully culture. We need to have a culture where we have more understanding, more dialogue. We need to have a culture where people understand that not everybody's cut out of the same mold. You have to treat different people different ways. And certainly, a culture that does not feed on this ridiculous notion that you can put your knee on somebody's head until they say, I can't breathe, and they quit breathing, or you can push a 75-year-old man down and just keep walking if it's just another day. That's the end of our first segment. Stay tuned. Up next, we have Mr. Chipp Jones. Welcome to our second segment from the Cheap Seats. We are going to have an interview today with a good friend of mine, Mr. Chipp Jones. Chipp is a native of Washington, D.C., born there, but he has lived in Brooklyn, and he grew up his formative years in Memphis. He was a road manager for a punk band called Big Bang Theory that almost made it. And he's also managed hard rock cafes. And it was during that time that he found that he had an interest and a knack in computers. and now he does IT consulting. And I want to welcome Mr. Chipp Jones to our show. Chip, how are you doing?
Hello. Good. Thanks for having me.
Oh,
I should make one correction. They weren't punk. They were alternative. So,
okay.
a
See,
little more melodic. They knew how to play their instruments as opposed to a punk band.
I could make a terrible joke like, and they're still living, but
That's right. That's still alive.
hey, I did make a terrible joke. All right. Um, we're going to talk about a couple of things, but I want to start with you talking about your bout with COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
I have a son who's 18 who has went through COVID, and I saw what it did to him, an 18-year-old who is at the height of his physicality, who works out. Um, how did you contract the virus?
Well, interestingly enough, I think I got it um, by touching a surface. My wife and I were shopping, and I reached for a can of something on the top shelf, and I dragged my hand across the shelf and dropped the can into the shopping cart and exhaled out and fogged my glasses. And on reflex, I reached up to sort of clear my glasses and touched my face and around my eye area. And then annoyingly to my wife, I kept saying, "Oh, I got COVID. I just caught COVID." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" "I just touched my face. So I know I've got COVID." And about a week and a half later, I had COVID. So when I look at the timeline and think back, I think that's when it happened. So you got to be careful what you joke about because you can, if you put it out there, sometimes the world will make it happen.
And as the supportive wife, I'm sure she said, "Okay, laugh now, funny man."
No,
Like
she has never really thrown that up in my face. So she she's a beautiful person.
now, how long between when you touched your eye and your first symptoms did
Like I
you?
said, it was about a week and a half. I had just finished doing an online Zoom comedy event, and I felt these chills, and so I went and took a hot shower, and then went upstairs and climbed into bed with my wife. And a few minutes after, she looks over, she goes, "What's going on with you?" And I said, "I don't know, I'm just freezing cold." She goes, "Yeah, you're shaking and your teeth are rattling." And so she went and got a thermometer and took my temperature, and it was like 100, 101, something like that, 100.1. And she said, "Oh, we should take you to the emergency room." And of course, being the guy, I'm like, "Oh no, this is fine. I can walk this off. I'll take some ibuprofen and I'll be fine." And she said, "Okay, but I'm going to wake you in an hour, and if it hasn't changed, we're going to go to the emergency room." So she woke me in an hour, and it had changed. In fact, it had gone up to 101 degrees,
Hmm.
and then I actually threw up. And so she took me to the emergency room, and they were in a lockdown protocol, so they wouldn't let her come in, but she kept making her way in, and the security guard goes, "Please don't make me have to throw you out." So she went out, and they got me into an exam room, and by the time I had gotten to the exam room, my temperature was up to 103,
Hmm.
and I was having all over body ache, and it was I wasn't having sort of the congestion of the chest. It was a pain, almost like bone pain. I had cracked some ribs in high school playing football, and it felt like that. That every time I breathed in, the my chest rib cage hurt. Um, and so the doctor came in, and he made a clinical diagnosis based on my symptoms that I had COVID. They walked me around the ER for several minutes to verify that my pulse ox wasn't in danger, and I was up like 95% or so. And then they X-rayed my chest to make sure that I didn't have any occlusion or something like that. And then they sent me home with a protocol. So I was isolated in my den and my den downstairs and the bathroom, and those are the only two rooms I could go in until I got through it. So I would text my wife or my son to bring me uh, Gatorade, juice, or water. I didn't really have an appetite. I tried to eat a couple times, but I wound up just throwing it up. So I went for basically 6, 7 days on Gatorade, juice, and water. Sleeping like 20 hours a day. I'd wake up soaking wet, take a shower, change into some fresh clothes, and go back to bed.
Now, your wife and son, they never contracted the virus,
They
did
didn't. No, and we stayed. I mean, like I said, I would text them, and they would bring the stuff and put it outside the door, and just knock on the door and go away, and then I would open the door and grab the stuff and
they?
bring it
Okay.
in. So
Now, how did that affect you mentally while you were going through that the isolation with the fever?
and I mean, I don't know if I felt the isolation because of the fever. I had these very intense lucid dreams. I think it's because of the temperature. Your brain's cooking, so you're kind of like the guy out in the desert. You have these mirages that just appear to be so real and lifelike, and can be kind of startling. Um, and so I had those, until my fever broke.
Was that the most intense illness you've ever had?
Yeah, I think I think it is. I mean, like I said, I cracked some ribs in high school, which probably, the pain was intense and it lasted for a longer period. But I don't think I've had sort of the intersection of so many maladies of having pain every time you breathe or move any part of your body, constantly feeling cold because your temperature was, so high.
Yeah.
And the massive dehydration because that's what I'm doing. I'm just replacing all the liquids that are just steaming out of my body. Because every time I woke up, after sleeping 20 hours, I was just soaking wet. It's like Paul Hogan, I guess, who played Crocodile Dundee, used to talk about shooting those movies out in the Australian desert that you would just drink all day and never have to go to the bathroom because it was just pouring out of your body as sweat. And that's basically the same thing I had as well. I was just, everything I took in, every time I woke up would just be in my clothes, just poured out of sweat.
Now, is DC reopened? I live in the Midwest, Missouri, right next to Illinois, near St. Louis. Missouri has been kind of opened, I guess, for a few weeks. Illinois is one of the last states to open, and they're now in, I think, phase 1, whereas Missouri is a lot more open. Where is DC with reopening?
DC is in phase 1 as well, so that means that basically no enclosed areas are open. So if you have a restaurant with a patio area, you can do that, or if you can create one, you can serve people out in the open. Everything else is going to be curb service. I work RT for a couple of high-end boutiques. Those are not open because they are enclosed spaces. The only enclosed spaces are ones that are deemed essential, which would be your grocery stores and your liquor stores. So I guess that's for your own mental health at home. So, but everything else is pretty shut down.
Now, how long have you lived in DC since you moved back?
Since like 85, I think.
Okay, so you've got a 35-year stretch
Yeah,
that you lived there. Okay.
yeah.
During this time where tensions are really high, is this the most intense you've seen the relationship between the citizens and the police?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's always been tension between the police and neighborhoods of color. You know, and it's a factor of the way police operate. Years of studies have shown that weed usage in the DC is evenly distributed between people of color and white people. Yet before weed became legal here, weed-related arrests were 97% people of color, and it just reminds me that often, well, almost always, you find what you're looking for, and
Yes.
police are looking for crime in black areas, so they find it. Where they're not so much looking for crime in white areas, and so they don't find any crime, even though we can obviously know that there is crime going on and the same crime and probably at the same level.
Now, you do have a rather famous resident in your city.
Hmm.
Um, what is your perception of how the president is handling this?
I think he's handling it like he handles everything else, poorly. So uh, I liken Trump to, I don't know if you remember as a kid watching the guy spinning plates on Ed Sullivan
Yeah,
or some show like that. And I think that Trump can only spin one plate, which is the economy, and everything else falls to the ground. And what he doesn't realize is if everything else falls to the ground, then the economy falls as well.
yeah,
So it's hard because I mean he for a long time we've known that he is somebody who doesn't really have empathy. He's a narcissist. Everything goes through the filter of what's in it for me, and that's not the kind of person you want in the ultimate job of service, you know. And
yes.
that's basically what the president is. He's the ultimate server for the country of America. And we've got the wrong person there.
See, the verbiage that's used is upsetting to me. A few weeks ago in the in Michigan at the Capitol, we had predominantly may have been all white uh, protesters surrounding the building, heavily armed, with their hunting rifles or whatever they had. And the president's verbiage was, "These are good people who are frustrated
Mm.
because they can't get a haircut or sit down at the Burger King or whatever they're frustrated about." Yet when we have the protesters, not just in DC, but around the country, his words for them, they are predominantly African American, are these are thugs.
Mhm.
And that leadership is setting a tone for people to say, white people are allowed to get frustrated, black people are not, because they're
Mhm.
going to be thugs. Um, when you, as a black man, hear that, are you outraged or shocked, or has it just been this way throughout our history and it's kind of like rolling off you
Ye-
a bit?
Yeah, and it is you know it works on multiple levels. I mean, it is something that's gone throughout our history. But the outrage I think comes from at least all the presidents before him, if not uh, in their heart, have at least put on a veneer of of not being racist. Uh, but you know, a lot of stuff with Trump is not only racist, but I said he's a narcissist, and so he gravitates toward anyone who's like him. So
Yes.
yeah, he can have a friend like Kanye who's extremely wealthy. You know, I think Trump is probably as dismissive to poor white people as he is. Uh, Probably not as much, but in the same vein as he is to poor black people. And he sees, you know, his supporters. He sees them as pawns for his own ends, for reelection, to be president again. But everything flows through the filter of what's best for Trump. And like I said, that's not the guy you want as the ultimate server, you know, because that's what the presidency is. It's about service, you know, not
Yes.
about personal gain.
Okay, Chip, you have the opportunity to sit down with the Senate, with the representatives, all of Congress, and you have the president and his cabinet, and they ask you a question: what should we do? What would you tell them?
Well, you know, I've thought about this a lot, and I think that one of the things that we might have to do is just give up for people of color this idea of reparations. I think that there are just too many hurdles to it. I think what our country should be focused on is poverty. And I think that's kind of like what Martin Luther King was headed toward with his Poor People's Campaign, is that if we actually worked at making sure everybody in the country, black, white, brown, whatever, um, had a sustainable life, that they had, you know, food, clothing, housing, you know, healthcare, education, that a lot of this stuff would fall away. I think that part of the problem that we have is people are so locked into a tunnel vision of just sustaining themselves day to day that they don't have the mental capacity to be compassionate to one another, to work on the big ideals that propel mankind and a society forward. Um, One of the biggest things I think that TV news could do is if they showed us every day what the top 20 companies or people made in America every day, I think people's eyes would be open and they would say, you know, we need to work a different plan. You know, America has always sold us what I call the lottery. You know, the idea of anybody can become a millionaire, or anybody can become president. It's always focused on the one person who wins big. But what we know with lotteries is that for every one person that wins big, there are millions that get nothing.
Yeah,
And we need to change the game so that we no longer have big winners, but everyone wins a little. Because the idea of living in a society where, you know, a Jeff Bezos who can be 6 years away from being a trillionaire, and yet we have thousands of people living homeless on the streets, it it's unconscionable, you know.
certainly, certainly. Chip, I do want to thank you for your time. You've been insightful and a delight to interview.
Thank
And
you.
as most of you probably don't know, Chip and I are both comedians, and we do Zoom shows together. So I will see you in the Zoom room. Okay.
All right, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Hey, wasn't Chipp Jones just fantastic? I love his insight and the things that he's went through with the COVID and living in Washington, D.C., seeing what's going on with his beloved city. It was just great to get a perspective of someone who's been there and done that. We're going to finish this initial episode with a segment on sports. I love sports, particularly baseball. My favorite sport is baseball. When I was a kid and I discovered baseball, I fell in love. I call baseball my mistress. Every year I wait for her to return. And my wife and my kids know that I'm going to be a little out of pocket because I'm going to watch a lot of baseball because I'm a baseball nut. Who do I watch? I watch my beloved Cubs. Yes, even though I grew up and have lived 80% of my life in St. Louis, I come from a heritage of Chicago Cubs fans from Central Illinois, and that was just ingrained in me from the time I was little. Now, we have a situation with the shutdown where baseball has not been going on. I've survived, okay? And now that things are starting to open up, they're trying to decide, how do we open baseball back up? We do know there's not going to be fans, so there's not going to be that revenue from the gate. So the owners and the players, billionaires and millionaires, are fighting over this. The owners are saying, you know what, we're not going to have the revenue that we should have during a baseball season, so we're going to have an abbreviated schedule. So you're not going to be able to collect your full income. You're going to have to take a prorated rate. And the players have said, okay, we'll take a prorated rate, but we need to decide how many games we play because, of course, if it's prorated, the more games we play, the more we get paid. And they've been jostling back and forth with this for weeks. And what that has done is continued to delay and delay and delay any baseball season that we could have this year. Baseball's missing a tremendous opportunity here because it's no secret that the average baseball fan is a 53-year-old white male. Right here, I'm your average baseball fan. We don't have the younger generations. We don't have a whole lot of the minority generations aside from the Latin kids who are playing baseball. The people that we have that are more of the European new immigrants, they're playing soccer. The black communities, they're not playing baseball like they used to. Only 7% of Major League Baseball is African American. So it's kind of a dying sport, and I understand why it's kind of a dying sport. It's because, I'll give you an example. I've got an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old boy. They don't watch baseball. You know why? Because it's boring. There's not much action. In an average baseball game, there is only 7 minutes of action. The rest is just, you know, stuff like that. I watch baseball because there isn't a whole lot of action. I watch baseball because there's a mental chess game with each pitch between the hitter who is trying to time his hit and smash the baseball and the pitcher who's trying to upset that timing. That just fascinates me. But I know it doesn't fascinate a generation who's used to video games and things moving fast, and the NBA and the NHL and the NFL being so much faster, Major League Soccer, more action type sports. So if baseball wants to pick up a few fans, they need to get their act together and start the season, because they would be the only sport going right now in a country that is starved for sports. They would have so many eyes glued to the TV of people who aren't watching baseball anymore because they're so starved for sports. But baseball's screwing that up. Baseball will probably not end up having much of a season, if a season at all. And if that happens, that's just going to expedite the death of baseball. Hate to say it as a baseball fan, but that's the truth. It's a dying sport. But you know what? 2016, my Cubs won the World Series. I finally got to see the Cubs win a World Series. I'm good. One thing these past 3 months have proven to me is I can live without baseball now that the Cubs have won the World Series. Our final issue on sports, I'm going to talk about NASCAR's decision to ban the Confederate flag. Those of you who are not from the South really have no idea how big NASCAR is in the South. It is huge. It used to be that we didn't have professional sports teams in the South, and NASCAR was their thing. NASCAR and professional wrestling in the 60s and 70s was their thing. NASCAR is still huge in the South, and with that Southern culture of the Confederate flag, it is everywhere in a NASCAR event. Well, NASCAR stepped and said, you know what? That's really not about culture. That was a culture of hate and of racism, and we really don't want to be connected with that anymore, so we're going to ban the flag. A driver, now I believe his name is Ray Ciccarelli. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name because, frankly, everywhere that I looked to find a video of this man where someone would pronounce his name, I couldn't find it. And one of the reasons, well, the only reason I couldn't find his name on video is because Ray Ciccarelli, Cicada, however he pronounces his name, is 0-31 as a NASCAR driver. So the only driver who is protesting the removal of the Confederate flag is the worst driver on the circuit. People, what does that say? You're a big loser if you're for the Confederate flag. Hey, it's been great having our inaugural episode. I hope you listen. What I hope you do is, whether you're listening to this as a podcast or if you're watching it as a YouTube show, leave comments. Let me know what you think about it. Good, bad comments. I want to hear them all. If you think this is a load of crap, tell me it's a load of crap. You wouldn't be the first one to tell me that I'm full of crap. If you like it, let me know. Okay? We'll see you next week. Thanks a lot.